In 1978, British doctors announced the first baby conceived of through in vitro fertilization. At the time, there was all kinds of predictions from this, that society was going to collapse, that there was going to be Brave New World kind of baby farms. One geneticist was quoted in Time magazine saying, "We're on a slippery slope. Western society is built around the family. Once you divorce sex from procreation, what happens to the family?" Now, of course, in vitro fertilization did not cause the downfall of society. Really, nothing changed except now that there are children conceived of through IVF. In Canada, it's about 7,000 children a year are born with IVF. Maybe you or somebody you know was conceived of through IVF. So there's a lesson here about making predictions when new technologies come around, that when a new technology comes out, that people are so commonly drawn to thinking that it's going to have these huge ramifications and could be really bad in various ways. It's usually dystopian. And there's also a kind of more specific lesson here about invoking the idea of slippery slopes. So in this video, we're going to take a look at that. To make a slippery slope argument or to invoke a slippery slope involves 3 steps. The first step is that there's some seemingly acceptable thing that it puts us at the top of the slope. So we can accept that, say, IVF might be totally fine. But if we accept IVF, so the argument goes, then that puts us on a slippery slope where we are invariably out of control down to the bottom of the slope, which is some dystopian outcome or some really bad outcome. So you got to have the kind of innocuous thing, but that kind of gets this chain reaction going where once it starts, we're going to lead to some really bad result. People talk about or use slippery slopes in other sorts of ways, but I think that's a kind of standard format of it. It's tempting to think about this as always being fallacious, as in the case of IVF, that it just didn't really come to pass, that all those predictions, they just turned out to be false. And sometimes slippery slope arguments are fallacious. If you look up slippery slope objections on Wikipedia, it's labeled as a fallacy, as a kind of mistake in reasoning. But it's not the case that predictions of this form are always a mistake, that sometimes slippery slope arguments can be correct. So let's look at a couple of those. One of the reasons it might be correct is that it can be true that if you start some process that could lead to worse results down the road. So people had this concern with the Dobbs v. Jackson decision for abortion that repealed Roe v. Wade in the United States. That people said that this was putting the US on a slippery slope towards worse protections or worse freedoms for women's reproductive rights. And that might be true. There's some evidence that that's happened, and those kinds of predictions might have been correct. Drug policy is another example, that in the early 2000s, when jurisdictions first started talking about legalizing cannabis or marijuana, that there were people who said that if we decriminalize marijuana or have medical marijuana, that's going to put us on a slippery slope towards the legalization of cannabis. Those people were right. That's exactly what happened. Decriminalization paved the way for legalization because it showed that kind of the problems with decriminalization weren't that significant, and so that made it more acceptable to go towards legalization. It wasn't inevitable that that was going to happen. So it's a prediction that is still risky. Those people might have been wrong about it, as the people were about IVF. But the idea that it kind of made it more acceptable, that turned out to be totally true. But there are so many other cases, like IVF, where people make predictions and invoke slippery slopes, and it just turns out to be time and again a mistake. So this is sometimes true of emerging new technologies, like IVF, or like in other cases with, I think that a lot of the stuff around AI and gene editing is like this as well. It's always some kind of thing in our brains that leads us towards kind of a Black Mirror style dystopia, even though so often that is not the case. Time and again, we don't keep running into these dystopias. One of the ones that stands out is same-sex marriage. In Canada, same-sex marriage was legalized in 2005. And in the run-up to legalization, there were a bunch of predictions about what same-sex marriage would lead to. So here's somebody, an opinion writer in a major national newspaper, writing, "There's no logical seam that will let you change man to woman or vice versa in the classic equation, but then balk at changing a 1 to a 2 or a 3 or a 60. This slope, I'm afraid, is pristine in its slipperiness." Well, what this person is talking about is the idea that if we legalize same-sex marriage, then that's going to open the door to polygamy, that people will be able to get married to as many people as they want. Another person wrote around the same time in 2006 that here in Canada, no one is proposing a pedophilia party yet, but thanks to Bountiful BC, which is this polygamous community in British Columbia. Thanks to Bountiful BC and same-sex marriage, legalized polygamy is now probable. And then she adds that the slippery slope that social liberals denied as they dug in their heels on same-sex marriage without having done their homework has commenced its inexorable work. So back in 2006, this person was predicting that if we legalize same-sex marriage, that it's going to lead to a pedophilia party and it's going to lead to legalized polygamy. Of course, neither of those things have happened, and so the prediction has turned out to be false so far. It's not only conservatives who make slippery slope arguments, though. After the Dobbs decision, which repealed Roe v. Wade, Stephen King tweeted, "Welcome to the Handmaid's Tale." Now, I think this is quite an exaggeration to say that the effect of repealing Roe v. Wade was going to lead to, as though like we're living in Gilead in the United States. That has not come to pass, that people can still get abortions. There are negative effects, of course, of that decision, but it's quite an exaggeration to say that that has like put us on the path or that we are now living in the Handmaid's Tale. I also see slippery slope arguments come up in discussions around medical assistance in dying. So throughout the debate around medical assistance in dying, which Canada legalized in 2015, that people have objected to made by saying that it's going to lead to a slippery slope. That if we legalize it, even for people who are consenting, that after a while it's going to lead to people who aren't consenting. And we're going to get into like, Nazi Germany style situations or, people being killed against their will. There's one an article in a medical journal that used an interview format talking to somebody, and then they conclude that medicine in collaboration with law has maintained an unwavering stance that the right to die produces a slippery slope effect whereby some patients may be obligated to terminate their lives prematurely. This is not true at all, of course. Like the law in Canada and the US has shown that it doesn't lead to a slippery slope. We have not had this rise in numbers of homicides, that the system is very safe. But nevertheless, when there's a big change proposed, such as assisted dying, that leads people to worry, to start thinking in dystopian ways in the same way that IVF and other things do as well. Okay, so what should we make of this? I think there are two broad takeaways. One of them is that I think it's just very hard to make predictions about the future. Whenever there's any kind of change, whether that's some new medical technology like in vitro fertilization, a new proposal in healthcare like medical assistance in dying, or big societal changes like same-sex marriage or the legalization of a drug, that often the proposal or the prediction that people make is that there's going to be some big effect, and yet usually that's not the case. Usually society doesn't change that much. That's not to say that it's impossible for society to change. We still need to be on guard that things could get worse in various ways. But it's just risky to make a slippery slope objection because that is making a prediction, and you really have to show that the steps line up. That if a slippery slope argument is going to succeed, you really have to show that starting that process is going to clearly lead to some negative outcome. And in fact, like almost all of the time when slippery slope arguments are used, that's not true. There just isn't that kind of effect. The other thing about slippery slope arguments is that I think they're often unnecessary. So in the case of objecting to the Dobbs decision, we don't need to invoke a slippery slope argument. We don't need to say that this Dobbs decision is going to lead to worse effects down the line. If that might be true, but the Dobbs decision was just a bad decision. Like the effects of it itself are bad. So we can just object to Dobbs on the merits without having to make big predictions about what the future is going to hold. It can be helpful to think about it in the future terms, like what direction it might be heading. But we can also just think about it on its own. For people who object to assisted dying, I think the same point applies, that if you are against assisted dying, you can just object to assisted dying and just say that it's bad to have people give them the means to end their lives, or for physicians to help people end their own lives. You don't need to say, because it's a riskier prediction, that if we have assisted dying, that's going to lead to some really bad result down the line. So just stick with the thing you're talking about without kind of going to these predictions. Okay, still, I don't think that we can say that all slippery slope arguments are fallacious or that they're always going to be mistaken. In some cases, when people make predictions or when people are saying some process is going to get started that's going to lead to some bad result, That might be true. We have to look at the facts, or we have to look at the claim that they're making to assess whether that might be true. Still, most of the time when people say that this is putting us on a slippery slope, the odds are that they're mistaken. So if you've got a bet, if you need to make a bet, that you'll usually be pretty safe by taking the bet that the predictions that they're making aren't going to happen. Thanks everybody for watching. I hope you liked this video. Please like and subscribe, and we'll see you in the next one.